Okay, now that you know how to add breakpoints in your program and look at variables in the variables console, let's see how we can navigate our code using the debugger controls. To start off, let's start with the debugging process. And once you're in the debugging mode, you can see that the line where you've added your first breakpoint will be highlighted. What this means is that up and until this point, which is line 20, any code in your main function will be executed. In our context, we only have line number 18, and we can see that it has been executed as we have an empty list which is called nums. Let's go over the buttons over here and see what each button does. The first one is called continue. What this does is that if you press this button, we will continue executing our code normally up and until we reach the next breakpoint or until the end of the program. In our case, since we have only one breakpoint, what it's going to do is once we click it, it's going to execute up and until the end. And we can see exactly that what's happening. Now suppose we add a breakpoint in our function called subtract numbers. What it's going to do is we start the debugging process once again, and if we press continue, it's going to go until it's going to continue executing a program up and until we reach the next breakpoint, which is subtract numbers. As we can see, subtract numbers is below over here. So that's how continue works. Let's remove this breakpoint and start the debugging process once again. The next button, and by far the most important button that you should be using while debugging, is called step over. What this does, it helps you step over each and every single line in your program. This is especially helpful if you want to see exactly what's happening with your variables after executing every line. So for example, let's step over line number 20. Once we do that, line number 20 gets executed, and we can see that as we have a new variable called num1 and it has the value 8 stored into it, and that's exactly what line number 20 does. 16 divided by 2 is 8. And then once we step over it once again, we will see that it appends the value of num1 into our nums list, and we can see that over here once again in our variable console over here. And if we expand it, we can see that there is more information about what's happening in our list. We can see that at index 0 we have the value 8 and the length of the list currently is 1. Let's continue stepping over our code. We can see that once we execute line number 23, we have a new variable called num2 and it has the value 30. And if we step over once again, this value 30 is stored into our list, and currently in currently it's stored at index 1 in our list, and the length of the list is now 2. Now that you know what step over does, let's see what happens with the next button called step into. What step into does is that suppose you want to know what's really happening in these functions, which is subtract numbers or divide numbers or add numbers. You want to know what's really happening instead of just stepping over them. Well, in that case, you have the opportunity to do that by using the step into button. Now once you click step into, what it's going to do is it's going to bring you inside that function. And one important note here is that you can only step into functions that you've written and uh, not step into functions that have been already provided by your Python libraries. So if you want to step into functions that have been already provided, you will have to change some configuration settings in VSCode, and that's a bit complicated and I wouldn't suggest doing that. So make sure that if you're using the step into button, just use it in functions that you've written. Well, step into function wouldn't work either way if you tried using it on functions that you've not written, but yeah, if you want to do that, it's possible. Now coming back into this, you can see that also that our variables console has changed, because now it's only reflecting the variables that are in our function. So for in our subtract numbers function, there's only two variables present, which is a and b. And one cool feature of VS Code is that if you hover over these values, you can see what they are. So for example, if you hover over the variable a, you can see that it has the value 8, and if you hover over b, you notice that it has the value 4. This is especially useful if you want to know what's happening with the variables at what their value currently have over here, instead of just looking at this, because if you have a lot of variables in your variable console, it might get a bit complicated and hard to keep track of. So this is pretty neat. Now if you step over this line, you'll notice that you get a new variable called result, and it has the value 4, and that's indeed what 8 minus 4 does. Now let's step over, and if you step over once again, at the end of the function, it'll bring you back to wherever you called the function from, and that's exactly what happened here. And now if you step over once again, you'll see that uh, your nums list has been updated, and now you have the value 4 appended to the end of the list. And now if you click into it, you get more details, and you'll see that it is stored at index 2 and your length is 3. Let's step into this new function called add1. Let's see what's happening in here. And you can step into, and you'll notice that there's a for loop here. And with the debugger, you can see what's happening with your variables as you are iterating through the for loop. And this is especially helpful because you never know how your variables are being changed uh, unintentionally or not while using a for loop. So if you step over this, you'll notice that it's appending the value 1 to each of our, it's adding the value 1 to each of our elements in our list. So you can see, for example, if we have 8 over here, what it's going to do after we step over, it's going to add the value 1 to it, and it's going to become 9. Now if you step over, notice how the value of I keeps changing as well. Now it has become 1. So now the value at index 1 is going to be added with 1, and we can see exactly that happening with the value from being changed from 30 to 31. And if you do that once more, you'll notice the value changing from 4 to 5. And now since the value of I has reached the limit of the range it's supposed to be iterating through, it's going to exit that loop, and it's going to come to the next line. And if you step over this line, it's going to print that line, the list over here. And finally we are at line 28, and finally if you step over, it's going to print the result. Now you might have noticed this is not exactly the right result, because 8 plus 13 plus 4 is certainly not 42. So there's something definitely being wrong in our program. So let's see what's wrong with our program. Let's start the debugging process once again. And you'll notice we are at line 20, the first breakpoint. So what should be the value that should be stored in num1? Indeed, it should be 8. Let's see what the value is being stored, which is 8, which is correct. Now we append this value to the list. Now let's see what happens with num2. It should have the value 13 because that's 10 plus 3. Now once we add this, we see that it stores 30. So there's something definitely wrong with our add numbers. So let's restart our debugger, and this is how you restart your debugger, by clicking the restarting debugger. And what this will do, it will bring you back to the first breakpoint. And you can step over all the way up until add numbers, and we can step into it to see what's really wrong with this. And we can immediately see that instead of adding numbers, it's multiplying numbers. This is a cool way to see what's happening. And if you start with the result and change it from a multiplication operator to the addition operator and save your program, you should also terminate your debugger, and this is how you do it to see the effect, to see the changes reflected into your program. So once you stop it and start it again, and if you continue all the way until the end, you should see that 8 plus 13 plus 4 is indeed 25. And there we go. So this is how you debug your program and see how your variables are being affected and being changed. And this is the right way to debug your program, instead of just printing everywhere and making your code way messier than it should be. This is the right way to do it. Now a few notes. You have two other log consoles over here, and this is specifically let's go over what watch does. In the watch console, once you are in debugging mode, what you can do is you can watch specific variables. So for example, if I want to watch what's happening with the list nums, you can keep track of it. And why this is particularly helpful is because suppose you are in another function, and that function calls another function, and it's like a bunch of nested functions. In that case, you don't know how your variables that are not necessarily in the scope of the function are being affected, and there's a good chance that it might being affected. So this is a good way to keep track of the variables, since over here, this will only show you the local variables. This is a good way to show the variables that you specifically want to look at and nothing else. What call stack does is that it helps you keep track of how deep you are into the function calls. For example, if I go a step inside divide numbers, it's going to show that this is the main function and divide numbers is the current function call you're into. Now suppose if divide numbers called another function and that function called another function, this will be a good way to keep track of how far or how deep you are into your function calls. And maybe it might get a bit complicated, but this is not that necessary. What you should really be focusing on is the variables console over here, and if you want to watch specific variables and how they're being affected, you can pin them over here. So yeah, this is how you work with the debugger. And if you have any questions or any more doubts, we have an exercise for you which you can use now to practice your debugging skills. So that's it from me. Thank you so much.